coming. I'll reiterate that. I'm really honored and excited to have Dr. Gail Levin talk to you today because as some of you know, she's like a movie star in my art history world because as a graduate student, I used her expertise in the research and books, and so it's going to be a real treat for me to
Where would it be better? You can put it
to get to hear her in person, and I know that you'll feel the benefit as well. Let me read to you a little bit of her accomplishments. So she's been one busy researcher. Dr. Gail Levin is a professor of art history, American Studies, and Women's Studies at Baruch College and the Graduate Center of City University, New York. She is an art historian specializing in art of the 20th and 21st centuries with diverse research interests that include the work of Edward Hopper, Marston Hartley, Yasuo Kumiyoshi, Judy Chicago, women artists, Jewish artists, Chinese emigre artists, and contemporary art of the United States, Europe, and Japan, as well as American studies and the cinema. Her books include Lee Krasner, a biography, Becoming Judy Chicago, a biography of the artist, and Edward Hopper, an intimate biography. Levin served as curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art and as a guest curator at the Museum of Modern Art and other venues. Also, an artist herself, photographs are included in the collections of the High Museum of Atlanta, the Pollock Krasner House and Study Center of the Stony Brook Foundation and the State University of New York in East Hampton, New York, and the Center for Photography, Woodstock, New York. Gail Levin received her BA from Simmons College in Boston and her MA in Fine Arts from Tufts University and a PhD from Rutgers University. Most recently, she's been granted a distinguished Fulbright chair to India, so this fall she'll be going to India lecturing on American art and researching contemporary Indian art. The reason Gail is here in Santa Barbara is that she is a guest of the Morris Squire Foundation in Santa Barbara. That's an art education institution in our community. They're bringing awareness of the arts to our community, and she's an artist in residence. So she is doing community outreach, and that includes having a show, which we're all invited to, and there's some flyers at the back, March 21st from 4 to 6 at the Santa Barbara Arts Fountain. So that's down in the Funk Zone, 120 Santa Barbara Street. And we'll put this on our Santa Barbara City College art website, and you can grab one of these little cards. So we welcome you to that event too on the 21st of March. And so without further ado, we've asked Dr. Levin to talk about Edward Hopper, an area of expertise, and so thank you so much.
Thank you, Joy. So can you all hear me in the back? They got me wired up. I'm likely to take off. It's great to be here in Santa Barbara, and what a beautiful campus you have. I don't need to tell you that. But I'm not going to tell my students back in New York City who are fighting a very cold winter. But I would like to tell you about my relationship with Edward Hopper, how I came to write so many books on him. My very first job after getting my PhD was as curator, the first curator ever, maybe the last, of the Hopper collection at the Whitney Museum, which was bequeathed by the artist's widow, Josephine Verstill Nivison Hopper. At her death in 1968, at age 85, she was less than 1 year younger than her husband, who died in Edward Hopper, who died in 1967, around just at the age of 85. And at her death, she left all of the work by him that she had left, so it was mostly early work and drawings, and all of her work, which was a lot of paintings, to the Whitney Museum. the Whitney, not knowing what to make of all this, started selling some of what they considered duplicates of Edward Hopper's work. And they took 96 of Joe's best framed works and gave them away to area hospitals, which kept no records. And they had all disappeared between she died in 68. They were given away by 73, and I arrived at the Whitney in my 20s in 1976. And they had all disappeared from area hospitals. I have a list. And you never know, they could turn up in a yard sale. But the rest of her canvases, they appear to have just put in a dumpster. I don't have any documentation on that, but I know what's missing because she left black and white photographs. So I'll be showing you some of those today, and many of them are reproduced in my book, Edward Hopper, An Intimate Biography, which is now out of print, but you can buy it very inexpensively on the internet for the moment. So it got reviewed with this big review on the cover of the New York Times Book Review by Michael Kamen, who is then head of the Historians Association. But it was a very positive review, but the caption writers could not resist mean man with a brush, meaning Hopper really painted very well, but also that he wasn't a very nice man. Well, his wife kept diaries, 62 little volumes, and they fought tooth and nail. He was 6'5", and she was 5 feet tall. And sometimes she recorded not only in her diaries, but to letters to her friend, the artist Carl Springhorn, a male artist, that sometimes Hopper would swat her with his long arm. But she once grabbed his hand when he did that and bit him to the bone. That's a quote. So I included that. That's one of the reasons it's called an intimate biography. So yeah, it has some dirt in it, but it's all verified dirt, at least from the point of view of Mrs. Hopper. I will show you that Edward did not keep diaries, but he made caricatures. So stay tuned. How did I get started with Hopper? Well, I came from the Deep South, and I went north. I knew I wanted to get out of there. So from Georgia, I went north to Boston to a women's college, and it was too far to go home for Thanksgiving break. So my friend Lisa Zappia, sophomore year, invited me to her home, her parents' home outside of Portland, Maine, and she took me around to show me the sights, and one of the places she took me was the lighthouse at Two Lights. I'm showing it to you now. And she said, Edward Hopper painted this. And I said, wow, let me take your photograph in front of it. And I never dreamed that I would someday locate all the places Edward Hopper painted that I could and put a lot of them in a book, which I would call Hopper's Places. And I would analyze how he changed the compositions from how they seemed in reality, or how one could record them in a photograph. And so the idea for my Hopper studies dates back to my undergraduate years when I was no older than many of you. And that's the snapshot I took. It's not in the book. And I'm interested, as you might hear the voice of a biographer, and I've written 3 of them. I'm very interested in an artist's origins, probably because my own mother taught me to paint, and then my parents forbade me to become an artist, saying they would disinherit me. And they weren't too happy when I became an art historian, but I felt I could defy them at that, because in the 60s, my art teachers were saying painting is dead, it's over. And all of you know that painting isn't dead, it's still being made, but now I know that every decade or so, its death is pronounced, and never true. But Edward Hopper also wanted to be an artist, and his parents felt the same way. After all, few parents want their children to starve, and we've all heard the expression starving artist. So Edward Hopper's parents decided that in those days, so we're talking 1899, right? He's born in 1882. So in Victorian times, he's born in Nyack, New York, 40-minute drive up the Hudson River from New York City. And Edward Hopper's parents decided that he could become a commercial illustrator, you know, making advertisements for magazines and billboards. So Edward had other ideas, and I'm showing you a sketch that he made and a detail, the whole sketch is on the right, from 1899, and he's about 18 years old, or 17 even, and he shows himself in his cap and gown, and he's holding his diploma from high school, and he's walking the path toward this mountain, and I don't know if you can read it in the back, but the mountain says the word fame. So Edward Hopper knew he was going to show his parents and prove how famous he would be. And by the way, when I went to become the curator of the Hopper collection and make the complete catalog of his work in 1976, right? My friends in the art world said, why are you going to the Whitney to work on that cornball artist whom no one is interested? Well, since then, he's become world famous. As you know, he's all over the internet. There are hundreds of parodies of his paintings. There are operas and symphonies after his paintings, and he's in films from Herbert Ross to Wim Wenders, and many, many other cinematographers, directors have put Hopper's paintings right into their film. So my friends were just as inaccurate as my painting teachers who said painting is dead. Now, I'm not telling you not to listen to your teachers, but now looking at that drawing again that I'm showing you a detail of, it helped me understand one of the paintings that Jo Hopper, Edward's wife, bequeathed to the Whitney Museum, which came unidentified, undated. And to top all that off, he painted normally on stretched canvas, but this was on a wood panel, and it's small, about yay big. But I recognized the motif. It was the stairway from Hopper's boyhood home in Nyack, New York, that place where he was born up the Hudson. And I recognized the doorway, and if you continued out, you would hit the Hudson River. It was right at the beginning of 2nd Street. But I didn't have any idea when he painted it until I read Jo's diaries. And in 1949, when Edward was around almost 70, he was facing major surgery, and he was feeling really pessimistic, and he was nervous. He didn't have a canvas stretched and ready to go. He only painted about 2 or 3 canvases a year, and he was dying to get his mind off of his impending surgery. So he found this old piece of wood panel, and he painted this painting. And what does he paint? The memory of that high school drawing going out that door to the unknown beyond. This is Edward Hopper's self-portrait in high school with his buddy Wallace Trimper. Can you see which one is Edward? He's the one on the right, the scrawny one. Wallace Trimper, his friend, became a master plumber, and Edward became a master artist. I'm sure his parents would have put their bet on the master plumber for being able to earn a living, which Edward couldn't do for many years, not as a painter anyway. But look what a wimp he makes himself at 6'5". A strong wind would blow him over. These are just after that, a year later, when he's at the New York School of Art. First, he went to Correspondence School of Illustration, I kid you not, and he was just studying commercial art. And then he talked his parents into going to a slightly better school, the New York School of Art, but only to study illustration. And his buddy, Clarence Chatterton, whom he called Chat, came in one day and handed him a palette and brushes and said, "It's time you took up painting." And so he did, and good at it he was. Here is a typical life class at the New York School of Art. And this is Edward right here, a male life model. The class is all men. They were segregated in those days by gender. Yet the men could have a nude female model. Wasn't quite that way with the male model and the women students, and there were women students, they were just segregated. This is one of the leading women students. Her name was Josephine Verstill Nivison. And Hopper first studied with William Merritt Chase, a kind of old-fashioned artist. Later, he was ashamed to have studied with Chase, who went out of fashion, but is back in fashion now. However, a more popular teacher arrived at the school, Robert Henry, H-E-N-R-I, and he taught Edward. Edward loved Robert Henry, became his favorite teacher. He told his students, art is life, and go to the theater, and Edward did that. Joe liked him too, and he liked Joe. Robert Henry, he asked Joe, he gave her the honor of posing for him for a life-size portrait that he called the art student, Miss Josephine Nivison. So Joe was super celebrity. After that, was painted in January 1906. So of course, she and Edward knew each other in art school, but he was very, very shy. And there is testimony from Joe in a recording with Edward present about all the times they saw each other after art school, at Ma Perkins' boarding house in Agunquit, Maine, where she said he was shy, or on Monhegan Island, where she said he had great dancing legs, but he was shy. So he was very introverted. She was gregarious and outgoing. So this is the life-size portrait painted by Robert Henry with Joe as the famous model. Today it's in the Milwaukee Art Center. Edward, after art school, had to work as a commercial artist to earn any kind of a living. So his family was pretty middle class, but he was trying to earn a living, and he made commercial illustrations. And this is in the age, in the early 20th century, when electricity was newly available. And he was illustrating, you see right here, for the Bulletin of the New York Edison Company. That's early electricity. And I want to show you, this is Edward right here at the Clarence Coles, C.C. Coles Illustration Agency. And Edward had studied at the New York School of Art illustration with a fellow student, Clarence Coles, who started this business. Now, Edward's commercial work, his illustrations, sometimes he saved tons of them, but he was very ashamed of them, and he hated doing this commercial work. And he said he would walk around the block. He just didn't want to go in and deal with the whole thing. But the subject matter and the formal qualities, the aesthetic qualities, the compositions of Hopper's illustrations often relate to his later paintings. So here you see one of people going to the theater, and I'm showing you the Circle Theater, used to be at Columbus Circle, a painting from 1936, a whole decade after Hopper did his last illustration. But Edward said, who an artist is, he always is, and changes little from birth to death. And I think although we all evolve, that we have the same brain and the same eyes, and I think he had quite a lot of who we are artistically is formed by the way we grow up. Well, after art school, Hopper went to Paris with the idea not of studying, but of painting and of seeing the old and modern masters. And his parents, who were very conservative, and they went to the Baptist church in Nyack, which his grandfather had been a preacher at, and they were, quite strict, not allowing dancing or drinking. So where did Hopper go and live in Paris? At the Église Évangélique Baptiste, which is the Baptist mission in Paris. And it's still there on the Rue de Lille, right on the left bank on the Seine. And you can see from my book, Hopper's Places, that's my photograph of the courtyard, and that's Edward's little panel painting. And notice he's painting very dark. He hasn't really discovered the Impressionists yet, but he will while he's there. And this is the stairwell, which looks very much like the one that's preserved. He lived with a widow and her 2 sons. And he continued to make illustrations. Now, he used watercolor in his commercial art, and he used watercolor as a boy when he made little cutout soldiers for toys. And he's already painting couples, which will be a motif we'll look at in his maturity. And the couples eventually find their way into his oil paintings, which he was unable to get any gallery to show. There were juried exhibitions at the National Academy. They all rejected his paintings. So this is one right after he comes home from Paris. He said he just couldn't get over Europe. In other words, it had such a profound impact on him being in Paris. And also he traveled. He spent from September to June, the end of June, the first time he went to Paris. And he traveled to Amsterdam, to Brussels, Amsterdam, Berlin, and to London. He never went to Italy. He went back in 1909 for another time to paint. And in 1910, his last trip, he did visit Spain, the last trip, and but he never went to Italy. But in Paris, I don't know if you've yet been to Paris, but a lot of people spend a lot of time sitting out in cafes, and they watch the people going by. And Edward did that, and he was very interested in the policemen and all the different Parisian types, but the type that interested him most, this is an example in the bottom of this pic slide of a prostitute. He knew all the slang names for the different type of prostitutes. The woman, la pierreuse, that pounds the cobblestones on the pavement, or fille de joie, a woman of joy, or in demi-mondaine, a kept woman. So what was going on? Excuse me, I'm having allergies today. But what was going on in New York while Edward was painting before and after he was painting the prostitutes in Paris was the women's suffrage campaign. Women were demonstrating and fighting to win the right to vote in America. And so I'm showing you parades that were outside and a poster, but Edward is not thinking about women's rights. He's thinking about other thoughts about women. And he's bored having to be an illustrator. This is one of his illustrations of offices. You know that magazine Business Week? This is the precursor of Business Week called System. And here he's painting an office, your business tomorrow. You're going to see that he's one of the odd painters who takes the office as a theme for some of his best mature paintings. But now I have a quiz for you. These 2 paintings Edward Hopper showed at the McDowell Club, which was a non-juried place where a group of friends, artist friends, could come together and have a show. And it's the first time that the press paid attention to Edward Hopper. And they praised one of these 2 paintings, and they didn't like the other one at all. So one of them on the top is called New York Corner, and the other one below it is called Soir Bleu, which doesn't have an English name, but means blue evening. So, first of all, I'd like to take a show of hands. Which one do you like best? Let's hear it for New York Corner. If you prefer that one, let's put up your hands. Okay, and how many of you prefer Soir Bleu? Okay. And how many of you think the critics preferred New York Corner? Okay. And how many of you think the critics preferred Soie Bleue? Okay. Those who said New York Corner are right about what the critics preferred. They liked it, but they didn't like Soie Bleue at all. They attacked it as an overly ambitious French fantasy. And he didn't even give it an English title. And do you recognize the background, the blue background? What does that relate to? And how about that woman with the heavily painted face? Do you know who she is? The standing woman? A prostitute, right. And how we know that for sure? We know it for sure. Edward made only one study drawing that survives, and he called it a mackerel. And that's, in French, in English, that's a mackerel. How many of you know the mackerel fish? You've heard of it, right? Smoked mackerel? Do you know what the slang is, what it means in French? Let me show you. Picasso used it too. And so a mackerel is a pimp or a procurer, somebody that makes their living sort of enslaving women and charging for sex with a woman and taking a big cut of the proceeds. So Picasso knew about this. And you can see Picasso's a little more explicit, but then he's Spaniard. And Edward comes from a puritanical American background. So this is this on the left is Edward's Fil de Joie. And so we see the character in Soie Bleue on the far left. That's the mackerel. That's the mackerel, the pimp. Now, do some of you know this painting over here? Anybody know the artist? Picasso. It's the famous Demoiselles d'Avignon. And those are the young ladies. They're not from Avignon. They're from the Calle d'Avignon in Barcelona, which was a famous brothel, a house of prostitution. And so Hopper paints Soie Bleue about prostitution. 7 years earlier, Picasso painted Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and before he did that, Picasso was into his blue period, which if you look at the background of Edward Hopper, who claimed he didn't like Picasso, I think he got a thing or two from Picasso. And then he said it took him 10 years to get over Europe. Well, here he is, finally able to get into shows with his etchings. He couldn't get his paintings, but the National Academy of Design accepted his etchings. And this one, Night on an L Train, has this couple like we saw in the French illustration, but it's tense. They're the only two people. It's late at night. And I'd like to say where I think he got the idea to do the L Train was from a very famous painting that won a prize of $100 in 1916 by someone Hopper exhibited with at the McDowell Club, which is how I discovered her. And her name was Teresa Bernstein. She was 8 years younger than Hopper. She wouldn't have been caught dead in the L Train at night, but she's painting and gotten her parents to pose the L Train in the daytime and won this big award. Oh, and by the way, my last book was on Teresa Bernstein. I did it with my graduate students. And Teresa Bernstein, even though she was only 8 years younger than Hopper, she didn't die. Hopper died in 1967. She died in 2002, 2 weeks short of her 112th birthday. So when I would talk with her, and I knew her from about 1985, it was like visiting a time machine and going back in time. Here is one of Edward Hopper's illustrations from 1919 for this Morse dry dock dial, a shipbuilding company. but it's a man in an office, and look how it comes out in his 1953 painting, Office in a Small City. But Edward's first fame came in 1918 when he won a prize for a World War I poster competition. And he was known as a famous illustrator. It must have killed him. He didn't want to be an illustrator. And the illustration was called Smash the Hun. But the war ended, and so it never got made into a poster. And so the editor, the art editor of the Morse Dial, put it as a cover image. And here it is. This is one of my favorite Edward Hopper etchings from 1920. It's called Les Deux Pigeons. It's translated the two pigeons. And like Soie Bleue, it has no English title. However, the lineage where it comes from, maybe you know, it's from the famous fabulist Jean de La Fontaine, French, and many, many illustrators have depicted this fable, and Hopper is now among them. And you can see another etching which appeared later in an illustration for hotel management, his catboat, and he built himself a sailboat called a catboat, which he sailed on the Hudson River as a boy. Well, in 1923, Hopper goes back to an artist colony north of Boston on Cape Ann called Gloucester, Massachusetts. And he bumps into Josephine Nivison, whom he knew back. Remember, she says she's seen him in Monhegan, and she's seen him at a gunquit at Ma Perkins boarding house. And now she sees him in Gloucester. Only Jo did not arrive in Gloucester by herself. She was on the boat with her baby, all in swaddling, and she had baby Arthur. And then she arrived, and she unopens the blanket, and Arthur was smuggled on. He was her alley cat. So Edward had to deal with Arthur, whom Jo was madly in love with. But they decided to go on a sketching expedition, Edward and Jo did, and she gets him to take up watercolor. And he paints her painting on the beach. That's from 1923. And they both painted the towers of Our Lady of Good Voyage. There are the towers in Edward's painting, and here's Jo's watercolor, which I don't have in color because it's at the Whitney, if it still exists at all. But the Madonna here does not hold the Christ child. Can you see what she's holding? A fishing schooner. Gloucester is a fishing port. And this church enchanted Jo because the Madonna is there so that the fishermen should return to port safely. When they got back to New York, the Brooklyn Museum was organizing a very important watercolor show, and they invited Jo to show her watercolors. She'd been showing watercolors, even though she held a job as a teacher of little kids on the Lower East Side in New York. And she said to them, well, what about the work of my neighbor, Edward Hopper? They said, Edward Hopper? Isn't he an etcher? Does he do watercolors? She said, sure. And they said, have him bring some over. We'll take a look at them. And they liked what they saw. They put up 6, including this one, next to Jo's, and Edward won the purchase prize. So Jo launched Edward. He was absolutely thrilled. They paid him $100. And he said to Jo, let's go back and paint again in the summer in Gloucester. And she said, no, no, no. I want to go back to Provincetown on the end of Cape Cod, where I've been before. It's much more interesting, it's much more fun. He said, no, no, let's go to Gloucester. They had a spat. He settled it by saying, listen, Jo, we'll go to Gloucester. We'll make it our honeymoon. And so they did, and that's how they got married. This is my photograph of how the sea captain's house looks in the Rocky Neck section of Gloucester. The Brooklyn Museum still has the watercolor. And this is the story that Edward tells us about how it was in the early days of his marriage. cohabiting with Arthur, who was none too happy to welcome Edward into the household. In fact, he was rather jealous. Edward was rather unhappy himself, as you can see, and felt that Arthur had the privileged position. Eventually, Edward dragged Arthur out of the household. I don't know how, but Arthur left, and Jo was devastated. They were supposed to go out to paint in Santa Fe, and for months, she wouldn't leave. Finally, she had to give up on Arthur, but he lives on in memory. So this is the sketch in a letter that Edward sends home to his mother. And notice he gets their scale right, little Jo, big Edward, 5 feet, 6'5", and he gives her the sun, Howe, as her halo. The last time he will give Jo a halo. These are Edward's watercolors in Santa Fe. And this is the painting that he does in oil at this time, 1925. Do you know this painting? Have you seen it in films? Maybe you know The House in Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock, where the murder takes place. This is the inspiration for Hitchcock. And this painting was bought by the heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune, Stephen C. Clark. And he gave it to the Museum of Modern Art, and it became the first painting by any artist to enter the permanent collection of New York's Museum of Modern Art. And it's a pretty special painting. I'm not going to go in depth on it, though, because I'll get bogged down here. I want to show you a little bit more of what's going on in the marriage. Jo was a feminist of sorts. She refused to cook, but she was 41 when they married. He was 42. How did he eat for all those years before? But now he's begging her for food. It's mealtime. And over here is the Sacrament of Sex, the female version. He drew it, but it's according to how he thinks he's got to perform for her. He's wearing a nightshirt, and who gets the halo? Edward. And this one's called There's a Virgin, Give Her the Works. For details on this, I refer you to my biography. But some of the watercolors are somewhat erotic. Note, this is his watercolor of Jo posing. He discovered he didn't need to spend 25 cents on a model at the Whitney Studio Club any longer, where artists would go as a group. Why pay for something you can get at home for free? And so she begins to take off her clothes or get dressed up or buy props to pose as the characters out of Edward Hopper's fantasy. They kept record books. Jo kept them. He made sketches after a while, and they named the characters, many of them, in his paintings. So this is 11 a.m., and she's only wearing shoes. And he loves to have a nude by the window or to be outside the window looking in as a voyeur at the nude. This is a watercolor from 1926. And so it's called Skyline near Washington Square, but that's not its original title. He originally exhibited as self-portrait. And remember, he was 6'5", which in those days was unusual. People are taller now. And so I think he identified with this tall building standing out from the crowd. This is the last print that Edward made, and it's of Jo. It's a dry point from 1928. And here you see how Edward originally painted his oils out of doors. This is the same place that I photographed when I visited my friend in Portland, Maine. And you see he did several versions of the Lighthouse at Two Lights, Lighthouse Hill on the top from 27, a watercolor, and 2 years later, the one that's in the Metropolitan Museum, the Lighthouse at Two Lights from 1929. Here's Jo posing as the anonymous woman, excuse me, in the Here is Joe. Here's Joe in the automat. And I want to suggest how much Edward Hopper loved Dutch painting and how he had seen the Vermeer that you see right now, A Girl Asleep, which was already in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum. Has a very similar kind of subject matter. But I don't know of any Dutch paintings that are so voyeuristic that have you peeking into a window from an elevated train as Hopper's Night Windows. And by the way, Alfred Barr Jr. bought this for the collection, or got this for the collection at the Museum of Modern Art. And he, the great modernist curator, organized Edward's first retrospective there in 1933. Well, what happens in the fall of 29 is the great stock market crash. Edward paints Railroad Sunset, which is really very hyperbolic and about change and the end of something. His chop suey, you can see this is a second floor Chinese restaurant. These are photographs. Whoops, I don't have the whole painting. Larger. This is early Sunday morning, which the new Whitney Museum bought and had when it opened in 1931. And notice the upper right corner, that is a skyscraper. Edward did not like them very much. And it's related to Vermeer's view of Delft. Flat, shallow. Here you have an example of Jo's painting of the South Truro Church, which she did before Edward, who made fun of her in this caricature. And that's his version of it, done later, not much later, on the top. Often when he had painter's block, she painted first, and his competitive edge would get him going. So there's his caricature of her. The Metropolitan Museum soon bought Tables for Ladies on the lower right corner from 1931, which I think is very much related to the Hall's, Franz Hall's painting, a bar scene on the upper right, or to the Jan Steen painting, also a Dutch 17th century painting. And look at the checkerboard floor. How Dutch is that? But the title, Tables for Ladies, bothered me for years until I found in a flea market this World War I vintage photograph. And do you know what Tables for Ladies were? In the days when girls and women had to have chaperones, or they would be thought, if they went out to a restaurant, to be prostitutes looking for men, there started to be respectable restaurants that would reserve tables for ladies that weren't prostitutes. And Hopper is recording that because, of course, the role of women is changing dramatically as he's getting older in society. So Hopper painted Hotel Room from 1931, and that's one of his illustrations, which is related in composition, but much chattier, right, with two characters. And that appeared in Scribner's magazine in the middle of the 1920s, just a few years before the painting. The painting is the only Edward Hopper painting that was acquired for a European museum, and it's in the Thyssen Museum in Madrid, Spain.
Do you want a cough drop?
Yes, thank you. Edward Hopper's room in New York, you can just see his annoyance, the man's annoyance with the woman at the piano who's disturbing him reading his newspaper. It's a little bit different than Vermeer's painting where the man and the woman communicate with one another. Do you know this painting? No? It's owned by the Santa Barbara Museum of Art. And Edward Hopper began it. It's the view from his New York studio in 1932, but he was unable to finish it. He became fearful, as he often did with watercolors. Although this is a big oil painting, he just couldn't bring himself to finish the sky. He waited until 1959 and he did it. Preston Morton came the next year and bought the painting and gave it that year, or either the year before, right after, as soon as it was shown, he gave it to the Santa Barbara Art Museum, where it remains today, although it's out on tour right now. This is the house that Hopper designed for him and Joe. Excuse me, this is in Truro on Cape Cod. It only has 3 rooms, a kitchen, a bedroom, and his studio that was their living room. And Joe was free to paint anywhere she wanted except in the studio. And the light was impossible anywhere else. They built the house with money she inherited from her uncle. Edward designed it. But this is his caricature of how it would have looked if Joe had designed it. This is the view of the roof in New York, from which he painted the view of Santa Barbara, same year. It was
Show us the Arnold Newman again. You went kind of fast by that.
Oh, my husband in the audience, he likes this story. Arnold Newman, quite a well-known photographer, the late Arnold Newman. Actually, I chose this painting as the frontispiece to the Hopper biography. Arnold complained only one thing. He said the biography was too heavy to rest on his belly in bed when he liked to read at night. But he said he inscribed a copy to me because he said that I really understood it. Because he said he tried to photograph tried to photograph Edward, but Joe, you see her, she kept getting into the picture. There she is. So she didn't want to be left out. So I'm going to skip some. This is in front of the big window, Joe painting by Edward on Cape Cod. This is his self-portrait. Did a whole chapter on this. It's in French. They were both Francophiles. It's called La Rêve de Josie, means Josie's dream. And in that basket of are books, including George Santayana's The Last Puritan. And there's a lot of things very puritanical about Edward Hopper, born in 1882. But he married Jo, who was one of the village new women, and much more bohemian than Hopper. This is her portrait of Edward reading Robert Frost, his very favorite poet, but it's one of the lost paintings from the Whitney. This painting was a commission for Charles MacArthur and Helen Hayes, a family in acting in the theater. And Edward didn't want to do it, but his dealer and his wife nagged him to do it. It was at the end of the Depression in 1939, and they felt he needed the money. And it was just the house up the street from the house Edward grew up in, but a much fancier house on the other side of the street overlooking the Hudson River. This is the kind of record book that Jo kept. This is her handwriting. And the cost of the painting was $2,500. Today it would be more like much more than $2 million, much more. Edward made the record sketch, and these are his notes about the colors and the kind of paint. This one, this is in the Museum of Modern Art. I hope you can hear me. I don't know if you've seen the Herbert Ross film, Pennies from Heaven, but this painting is actually part of the film activity in the movie itself. It takes place here. So you've got Steve Martin and Bernadette Peters sitting down, And Steve Martin actually gave me this still. He has collected Hopper and I think sold Hopper. And Jo posed. Of course, she posed for all the figures. That's one of more than 50 drawings with Jo posing. And Hopper went to more than 5 theaters. It's not one movie theater. And now, here you see, Edward painting Office at Night, which was the theme from his work as an illustrator. We're in 1940. But the artist that he loved was the Frenchman Edgar Degas. And he owned a big book of Degas, which was a gift from Jo when they got married. And I think you can see this looks a lot like in the cotton market. This is an American scene painting. Degas visited New Orleans. He had relatives there, French relatives that were involved in the cotton market. And by the way, if you see the pose of the man in this Degas, you can see that's Jo's pose in New York Movie. This is relating it to Edward's commercial work. But here, I want you to see these are 3 drawings for this painting. See, he's erased the chair. He doesn't want to look too much like Degas. He loved night scenes, and at the time, he loved Rembrandt, and everybody thought the Night Watch was really at night. Now we know it wasn't. And in Office at Night, Hopper puts painting on the wall, just like in Degas, and then he takes it off. He doesn't want it to look too much like Degas. Whoops. There you see the painting on the wall is a trope in Degas. You all know this painting. Hopper's most famous in the Art Institute of Chicago. Painted, he had a blank canvas. He posed with it for Arnold Newman because he had nothing recent around the studio finished. He didn't know what he was going to paint on the canvas. It's about yay big. And he was stuck. And then, that was November 1941. What happened on December 7th? Pearl Harbor was bombed. And Hopper started painting this scene of discomfort in the night because everybody was worried, especially Jo, that the Germans were going to bomb New York City. And Hopper has skylights at Washington Square. They were on the top floor. And there was a blackout, and he didn't want to paper over his windows. Another influence was Hopper and Scribner's, which was where he published his last illustrations, 1926. In 1927, Ernest Hemingway's story, The Killers, was published in Scribner's. It's about a murder being staged that never takes place. Hopper wrote Scribner's a letter praising Hemingway, whom he thought he'd discovered. And then his patron, Stephen C. Clark, the one that gave House by the Railroad to the Modern, owned this painting. You know this painting, Van Gogh's Night Cafe? Another nighttime scene, and it was shown at the Museum of Modern Art. So these are 2 renditions by Hopper of Jo painting. In one of them, you can see what she's painting. It's out in Mount Moran, out in Wyoming. I'm just gonna skip ahead. This couple in a bedroom, very different than Rembrandt's tender so-called Jewish Bride from 1949. But look at the relationship The Light on the Wall to Rembrandt's St. Paul in Prison. This is the view from Edward's Cape Cod house across the bay. It becomes his rooms by the sea. This painting was bought by Stephen C. Clark, but his wife made him return it. You know why? She said, people are going to think we bought a painting of a communist meeting. Edward was so anti-communist. This was the McCarthy period, and there was paranoia in the air. So the painting was not owned by the Clarks. Again, Hopper looks to Rembrandt for composition, for the good. He looks for this sunlight on brownstones in 1956. In other words, Rembrandt depicts the stoop. Excursion into Philosophy is Hopper's other unhappy bedroom scene, and Hopper quipped about the man. He's been reading Plato rather late in life. This painting, 4-Lane Road, in 1956, Jo was so upset about it. If she didn't pose for either the man or the woman, Edward had no models, but she said he's painting that woman like an ugly shrike, that's a kind of aggressive bird, because he's so angry at me. So I chose it as the cover for the first edition of Edward Hopper, an intimate biography. The record books. And Hopper's dealer looked at this painting and said, why, Mr. Hopper, and this was the younger dealer that had succeeded Frank Wren at the gallery, why, who's the model? And Jo at the time was 78 years old, and Edward, without pausing for a moment, said, why, that's Jo, glorified by art. Here, there were figures in this painting from 1963, but Edward painted them out. I like to think that the short and the tall are Edward and Jo. Here you see her looking on at the Cape House when he was painting it. And this is Hopper's last painting. After belittling Jo's efforts as an artist, not believing any woman should be an artist, including George O'Keeffe, Edward finally lets her bow out with him on the stage and share the moment. He said to her that he represented the two of them. He was already sick. He would die less than a year and a half later. And we know what happens in the theater when the actors take their bow and then the curtain comes down and the lights go out. That's the end, just like death. And in Jo and Edward's case, they had seen Marcel Carné's film, Les Enfants du Paradis, Children of Paradise, about the Commedia dell'arte actors. And they were so enchanted with this film that they sat through it twice when they saw it for the first time, and it becomes Hopper's last painting. And those are my last words, but I'll be happy to accept your questions. Thank you.
I'm not sure if you mentioned earlier.
Speak up and shout.
I'm not sure if you mentioned earlier, but
Can you try to be quiet so everyone can hear the question, including me? Thank you.
I'm not sure if you mentioned it earlier, but how did you come to fall in love with Edward Hopper and his work?
Well, I just how did I begin to fall in love with Edward Hopper and his work? I just was getting my PhD. And I had already gotten a teaching job at Connecticut College. And I kind of wanted to get back to New York. And I got invited to be curator of the Hopper collection and write the complete catalog of his work for the Whitney Museum. And I already had that early interest in realism and Hopper. I actually wrote my undergraduate thesis on the 15th century Flemish painter Jan van Eyck, who was a realist. And I thought, well, I can work on realism. And, you know, as I started to study Hopper, it was like peeling away layers of an onion, and it became fascinating for me. So that even after I left the Whitney, I wrote many books on Hopper. It's Hopper's work that held me. While I was at the Whitney, I wrote some other books because I didn't want to do just one thing. You know, you like a varied diet. But I've never gotten tired of Hopper. Anybody else? Yes?
Gail, I noticed in the late paintings, especially that one that you showed before this that has the rectangles, these kind of mustardy colored rectangles. It's such an architectonic structure, the way he leads into the paintings on both sides with that larger rectangle in the middle. At this time, the minimalists were really around. Was he at all influenced by minimalist art, or did he have any connection in looking at art that was more contemporary?
That's a really interesting question. She points out the relationship to this in the 1960s to minimalism, and the minimalists, of course, loved Piet Mondrian, who's very geometric. Artists like Barnett Newman also were loved by the minimalists, people like Carl Andre and Don Judd. But no, Hopper wouldn't admit to liking anything abstract. Those artists like